our floodplain unit. First, a little housekeeping. We are in listen-only mode, so please make sure your mics are muted. If you're having Wi-Fi issues, you may want to turn off your camera and any other programs you may have running. Please be sure to make note of the chat feature on your screen. Please use the chat for communication, as we will not be taking questions by audio. Isabel Rogers of Dewberry is monitoring the chat. We'll try to help you with any technical matters. We are offering one continuing education credit for CFMs. To receive the credit, you must be logged in separately, answer all poll questions during the session, and provide your name and email at the end of the presentation. Please be sure to use the radio buttons to respond to the poll questions in either the pop-up window or the chat box. Please be sure to check that chat box for the survey. A copy of the presentation will be emailed to all attendees. Also, a survey link will be provided at the end of the presentation. We appreciate you completing the survey so that we can improve these webinars in the future. We are recording today's webinar and plan to post the video on georgiadfirm.com. And with that, let's get started. Today, we have a presentation about environmental justice, how we change so everyone thrives. Our presenters are Jessica Ludi and Pamela Backus of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Jessica is the Silver Jackets and Environmental Justice Coordinator for the San Francisco District Army Corps of Engineers. She's also on detail with the Assistant Secretary of the Army Civil Works Office for Environmental Justice Policy. Jessica has over 15 years of experience in private and public sectors working on integrated flood risk management in communities across the U.S. Jessica received her master's degree in environmental planning at UC Berkeley. She spent 2 years in the Netherlands as Fulbright scholar researching the multi-layered flood safety programs. Jessica is the co-chair of both the Flood Risk Communications Committee and the Social Justice Task Force at the Association of State Floodplain Managers. Pamela Backus is the Silver Jackets and Environmental Justice Coordinator, also a biologist and planner in the planning branch of the Savannah District of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Her passion for natural resource conservation led to a bachelor's degree in biological sciences from the Tennessee State University, with an emphasis on sustainability and best management practices within the U.S. Corps. Pamela has served as a natural resource specialist, water quality biologist, and environmental planner. The objective of her work is to examine and formulate sustainable solutions by intersecting environmental policy and operational procedure with the planning process early on. Her experience has conjoined shoreline management, geospatial data, real estate, environmental compliance, and watershed management for more dynamic management practices. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica and Pamela.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much also for having us here. So starting with some learning objectives for today, we are looking to help you all, us all, recognize the ways in which environmental justice issues show up in flooding and the flood risk management practice. We want to understand the drivers of these environmental justice concerns. We hope that we all can see ourselves in this process and as agents of change or interveners, and hope that you take away actions that you can do to advance environmental justice in your spheres of influence. So we will have a long and informational, information heavy webinar today that will follow this trajectory. We'll provide some introduction and basics to get on the same page with language and what we mean when we say certain things. We will then talk about how inequity or environmental justice issues show up in flooding. We'll discuss how we got here with a look to the past, and then also kind of actions for change. So that's the flow.
Jessica, are you sharing your screen?
Yeah. Did it come off again?
We lost it as soon as you started talking, so.
Oh, okay. Thanks for asking. Sorry, why is this? Thanks for letting me know. Let me share again. That's weird. Window. Share. All right. Let me know when you can see it.
See
We
it
see-
now.
We see
You can?
today. It says
Okay,
today.
great. All right. So that's what I just stepped us through. That's the flow of the agenda. So I want to start by recognizing, appreciating, and acknowledging the many Indigenous communities, African American communities, Latino communities, and all other um, communities of color uh, that have really been the original leaders of the environmental justice movement and have been working at the nexus of um, environmental justice, civil rights, flooding, other hazards for decades and decades. Everything that um, you'll hear today from my side comes from what I've learned from them and their work, or authors, scholars, activists, of people with the lived experience of criminal justice. And so I kind of want to give deference to them and appreciate gr- the the work that they have laid before us that allows us to do this. And also in this slide, kind of point to the fact that you hear a lot more now about environmental justice at an agency level, and there's definitions and policies, but that environmental justice really started off as a movement to undo the decades of discriminatory policies that disproportionately exposed Indigenous people, Latinx people, African Americans, and other people of color to toxic air, land, and water, disconnected them from their lands and waterways, their cultural and ceremonial practices, their recreational opportunities. So, and the environmental justice movement is intended to undo those so that everyone can thrive and have access to the benefits that at present only some people have right now. So our work builds on theirs. Why is this not clicking? Sorry. Okay, maybe I can use this. Aha, that works. All right, starting with some definitions and concepts that we'll be using, so you know what we mean when we say it. I just want to briefly, you've probably heard this before or seen something before, or seen some great cartoon graphic, but we will probably be using words like equity and equality. And they're not the same thing, even though they're similar. And the concept of equity is that everyone gets what they need. So we're thinking about outcomes where everyone can get to a desired end. For example, everyone gets access to clean air or water. Equality is where everyone gets the same. So you go, well, you get $5 and you get $5 and you get $5. Um, but maybe I'm Jeff Bezos and $5 doesn't really mean much to me. Or maybe I am living unhoused and $5 might not really be what I need to get out of homelessness. So yeah, there's this oversimplified as everyone gets what they need versus everyone gets the same. And they, yeah. So here we go. So, since he's been in the administration, President Biden has passed a series of executive orders that ask the federal family and the people who receive federal funding to really advance uh, issues of historical inequity so that everyone thrives. And they do this through a series of executive orders, the most recent of which is Executive Order 14096, came out April of last year. But environmental justice as a policy in the United States has been in effect since Executive Order 12898, signed by President Clinton. Um, and you don't need to read all of this right now, but I strongly suggest, I think this is the executive order itself is a good piece of reading and education. President Biden clearly had a lot of smart people helping him write a good executive order. And what it talks about is the just treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in agency decision making and other federal activities. The old definitions used to say the fair treatment, which people took to mean the same treatment. But from the equity perspective, the same treatment isn't what everyone needs to actually all get to the same healthy outcomes. So it's the just treatment in decision making and other federal activities that affect human health. And the intent, this executive order has an intent here so that all people are fully protected from disproportionate risks, hazards, climate change, cumulative impacts, and the legacy of racism and other structural or systemic barriers. And the other piece here is not just this do no harm piece, but it's getting everyone access to a healthy, sustainable, and resilient environment in which to live, play, work, grow, and worship, engage in cultural and subsistence practices. So it's sort of two parts. And what we see today is that there is a substantial gap in flood resilience, for example, amongst all communities and many other environmental related issues where all communities, the whole community, does not have access to clean, safe drinking water, clean air, resilience to flood. And this image is intended to represent the diversity of lived experience in the United States. And yet many in this picture face some significant systemic barriers to accessing clean water, recovering from storms. Many aren't well represented in the decision making processes that affect them, nor have they been equal recipients in those benefits, those economic, social, and environmental benefits of our flood risk management and other systems, infrastructure systems. So who is most affected? Who are we talking about? You hear a term which is somewhat what do I want to say? There's definitely a critique of it because the intent is not to lay it on the individual, but right now this is one of the terms that is used where social vulnerability or people who are socially vulnerable or populations or groups of people that face disproportionate disaster risk due to a variety of social, economic, and political factors. And so who are these groups of people? I'm sure you seen others and more and could add to this list, but I just wanted to put a few on the screen. And I think what's really important to remember, and the Natural Hazard Center reminds us of this, is having these characteristics does not make someone inherently vulnerable. Their vulnerability is caused by external factors, right? For example, um, someone in a wheelchair is not necessarily excuse me, someone in a wheelchair is not vulnerable inherently, right? They cannot get onto a sidewalk or into a building if it's only got staircases and not elevators or ramps or those sorts of things. And so that vulnerability exists because that building, that sidewalk was designed without universal access in mind. It was designed most likely without people with mobility challenges at the table. Does that make sense? So, my child can't reach the sink in the airport, not because she's in the bathroom airport, not because she's vulnerable or there's something wrong with her, but because despite the millions of children that go through airports today, for some reason we did not consider them when we are designing bathrooms in the airport. And the only reason I use this example is because it didn't hit me till like 2 years ago during the pandemic. I was taking my child to a children's museum, and it was the first place where they had a sink and also a toilet that was appropriately her size, because that museum was intentionally centering children and how they designed the place. So in any case, that just points to the external factors being a major cause for vulnerability. And I want to say, building equitable resilience, building environmental justice for all requires us understanding both the past and the present, the context of how we got here, and the ways in which things that we do today could make things better or worse. And I give this as a bit of a disclaimer is to sort of say that during this presentation, we're going to touch on historical practices, policies, and decisions. And I've observed that these types of conversations can sometimes feel uncomfortable for many people involved or all people involved. For example, if any of this is new history, or maybe you're just not used to talking about this out loud, or you're seeing something in a different light, it can be upsetting. Or if you are someone whose experience has been marginalized by our society and in history, and you have living family or ancestors and friends who have been affected by these, it can also be very painful to sort of relive. And in terms of education around this, like we're all in different parts of our journey. We all come from different lived experiences and we bring something different to the table. When I first started doing this work, as a woman who has been socialized and racialized as white all her life, I experienced many feelings of shame, guilt, anxiety. But what I've learned is that the discomfort is where the learning really happens and where the work begins in order to really do this work. And so it's okay if you feel uncomfortable. There's nothing wrong with you. Have grace with yourself and with others. Notice the feelings as they come up and spend some time thinking about them later on. Just be curious and ask questions. I wonder where this might be coming from. What am I assuming that's bringing up this feeling? I want to, it might go without saying, but I want to say the intent of this conversation is not at all to make anyone feel ashamed for actions that happened in the past. It's to really sort of open our eyes, understand how we got here so that we can see where and how we can build the future that we really want to be a part of. So, to sort of say, how do these issues show up in flooding? There are many ways, and you can probably tell me many more from your experience. I will just touch on a few, but I want to say that inequity or environmental injustice show up in all three phases of the flood risk management cycle. This picture right here is a oversimplification. It's intended to show that the research, which shows that low income people, people of color, or people who are, quote, socially vulnerable, are already disproportionately living in more flood prone areas. So they're more likely to be flooded to begin with. Um, during a flood is that a lot of shelters may not have what you need to accommodate people in wheelchairs, older adults, refer for medical equipment, beds or toilets that you can access. They may not be safe for you if you're a person who, or you may not feel safe if you're a person who identifies as in the LGBTQ community. Another way that inequity shows up during a flood is in order to evacuate, you need to have access to a vehicle, you need money, you need a place to stay. And if you don't have one of those things, you're not going. You might be stuck if in a dangerous situation. I've been told by one of our partners at Cal OES that he's in a wheelchair, and he said that if a bus comes to evacuate him and it is not set up to accommodate his wheelchair, then he has to make a decision about whether he goes without his chair, without his integrity, without his ability to move around, or he can stay. And those are really challenging decisions for people. And then after a flood, I'm sure, and I'm not the first person to say this to you, but there's a lot of research out there that shows that that how we as a nation administer our hazard mitigation and recovery programs, and this goes beyond FEMA, this is Army Corps, this is others, it actually makes inequality and inequity worse after a disaster. So there's a lot of great work out there that talks about how that works. And then finally, floods are going to make any pre-existing inequities worse. So with all that said, what is our role in advancing environmental justice? And I pause this here because in these early discussions, which is what led to the ASFPM task force, there was a lot of chat that, we don't have a role, or I'm just an engineer, I follow these policies, we got to get our projects through the process. But what we're learning, and I'll share a little more today, is if we just continue with the status quo, implementing projects exactly the way that we have been doing before without intentionally centering issues of equity and justice, we're going to cause or perpetuate pre-existing harms even if we don't mean to. And it's not because any of us have racist intentions, it's because we're within a system that's been built upon policies and practices that were established decades ago when those decision makers didn't have equity in mind as a priority. So, as flood risk managers, as water professionals across local, state, federal, regional governments, we affect projects on the ground, right? And we dedicate funding and we make decisions and policies that can all shape our built environment. So, frankly, we have a major opportunity to close this gap and build the nation that we all deserve. And we, as I said before, we're not responsible for our ancestors' decisions, but as we're learning, we are responsible for how we choose to lean in and move forward, so that everyone can thrive. And now Pamela will, my colleague Pamela will talk about a Georgia context.
Thank you, Jessica. So, yeah, here as a steward of water resources, the Savannah District looks at 4 primary mission areas, with also consideration for the impact it might have on our water resources. So, primarily that's flood risk reduction, that is stream and shoreline, or stream bank and shoreline erosion control, water supply, and sustainability, and therefore consideration for how that might impact water quality. So our relationship with water has many faces, and our relationship over time has it's a shared relationship, but it is heavily influenced by our proximity, our function, and our interactions with these resources. And so what we've seen is a disproportionate allocation of resources based on that proximity and function. And in my work as the Silver Jackets and Environmental Justice Coordinator, what I'm starting to gather from this graphic you're seeing of the watersheds in Georgia is that a lot of the emphasis has been put on the coast, as it is across the nation, and that there are maybe some inequities that we are seeing in the upper parts of Georgia, central, and somewhat of the inner coastal sectors. So you want to go to the next slide, Jessica? So an example of some of the work that we're doing in the Savannah District, this is a project that we are partnering with Georgia DNR on. It is a flood inundation mapping effort in which this community is Chattooga County, very rural population, and their most recent flood event was in September of 22. And in the following slides, you'll see the type of damage that they had endured during that event. It caused a significant rift in this community, not just because of the damage, but the displacement of people. When we started this program, or we started this project in February of 23, we were able to see some of the recovery efforts that they still have ongoing. We were able to see the water lines in the buildings and how their critical infrastructures had to be relocated to different facilities, and how they're still trying to rebound. Given that this is a small community, recovery is not as quick, efficient, not as doable as maybe in some of our other areas that we're used to seeing. And then additionally, this area also had a flood study done in 1978, which did not amount to the level of benefits in order to get a project, a project started with the government. So we're seeing a long-term flood risk that certain communities are having to put up with until they can demonstrate that that the benefits are there, or that they can afford to fix it. You want to go to the next slide? So another project I did was in Atlanta, Georgia, and this is a community in South Atlanta that when you get significant rainfall, it blocks off this road and it makes it impossible for the community to cross this path. So it's isolating a community. And what is significant about it is that this area is a low income area, and it has a larger population of elderly or senior citizens, and so their ability to respond or recover or evacuate is different than you or I. You want to go to the next slide? And then lastly, it brings us down to the coast, where we see more of the prevalent storm surge hazards and other, hurricane natural disasters, and where there's low topography, flooding, where there's a major storm event or sea level rise. The existing relationship that we have with Tybee Island, as opposed to Chattooga County, really impacts the level of investment. I don't know if I'm hoping everybody's been to Tybee, but it is not. They experience flooding, but it is their recovery time is significantly different than that of Chattooga County. And next slide. All right, so we have our first poll question. I'll just go ahead and read it, and I believe it's going to pop up in the chat. What are key components and objectives of environmental justice as defined by the federal government? And select all that apply. And we'll give about maybe a minute or so.
So if you'd like to receive 1 hour of CFM continuing education credit, please answer the poll question. You can answer using the buttons in the pop-up on the screen. And if the poll doesn't appear as a pop-up, please check for it in the chat. And we'll give a few moments for you to review and answer the poll question.
I'm afraid to look at the results as they come in because I don't want to accidentally stop sharing my screen again. So I'll have to have one of you say what you see.
It looks like we have quite a few votes for just treatment of all people and agency decisions and other activities. Okay. Meaningful engagement of all people in agency decisions. Yep. Equitable access to healthy and sustainable and resilient environments. Absolutely.
Alrighty, I think most people have had a chance to answer, so I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll.
Okay. Okay. And I guess just let us know when it's all right to go forward. Okay.
Whenever you're ready.
All right.
And all right, I'll pass it back to Jessica.
All right. Thanks, Pamela. And thanks, everyone. Okay. So how did we get here to this situation? I encourage everyone to think a little bit about, or maybe a lot about, place and space, because environmental justice issues are really place-based. They don't occur the same everywhere across our landscape. And so we will end up hearing a bit about how people got to live where they are. And that is a very closely connected issue with areas that today experience environmental justice concerns. So historically, like in other infrastructure in the United States, for example, the railroads, inequity and inequality are also in the foundation of our very flood control systems. So moving from left to right here, much of the Mississippi River levee system, which was originally constructed by forced labor of enslaved people taken from Africa through the Atlantic slave trade in the 1700s. And the descendants of them, of those who built the levee systems, they never benefited from the economic wealth that was generated from the cotton or other types of farming. After emancipation, African Americans who continued to farm along the Mississippi River were denied opportunities to own land or had land taken or to earn fair market wages due to local and federal laws. In the middle here, over on my coast, the California Delta levee system were built largely by exploited Chinese immigrant labor at $1 a day in terrible conditions in the 1800s. And they too never benefited from the wealth generated in the Central Valley. And in fact, shortly thereafter, they were forbidden from owning land for a number of years. They were blamed for the Great Depression. And Chinese immigrants were excluded from coming to the United States via the Chinese Exclusion Act. And they also faced many acts of violence against them, which forced them into safer spaces, which is why in San Francisco's Chinatown exists. On the right, we see Sioux Chief oldest son looking out over the former floodplain of the Missouri River on an official visit to the Oahe Dam in South Dakota. In the 1940s, Congress passed the Pick-Sloan Plan that resulted in the construction of a number of dams on the Missouri River. And while this provided meaningful flood control benefits for some people, the dams permanently inundated tribal lands and reservation, forcing thousands of Native Americans to relocate. We have our own story of this in San Francisco district. And one of the most perhaps notorious historical examples of inequity in flooding is very well documented in the 1927 Great Mississippi Flood, where you match forced labor with unhygienic living conditions and human rights abuses in the quote refugee camps established by the American Red Cross. So at the time, plantation owners feared that they were going to lose their cheap labor force because of the flood. And so they partnered with the American Red Cross to create refugee camps in order to keep the labor force around. And in many cases, African Americans were not allowed to leave the camps, unlike their white counterparts, their counterparts of European descent. And they were forced to work on levees in awful and extremely dangerous working conditions. There are some accounts of people being taken off the out of their homes or off the street on their way to work to forced to be work on the levees. On the right, we see a postage stamp that came out a few years ago to honor American soldiers of Japanese descent from World War II. Little is known about the work of Company B of the 1800th Battalion. This battalion was a group of American-born soldiers, and they're honored today for their heroic acts flood fighting and saving lives on the White River in Arkansas in 1945. But they did this work while living in internment camps or replacement camps during Executive Order 9066. A couple of things to talk about. It's helpful context in understanding these issues today to think about the old rules. So I'm saying the old practices and policies between a couple close links that I'm going to share. So in the old rules, so basically since European settlement in the what is now the United States, the old rules said that in order to gain wealth, you had to own land or property. And it's pretty well known that majority of wealth built amongst the working classes in the United States relied on homeownership. That's how a lot of people depend on wealth or paying their bills today is through homeownership. The old rules also said that in order to vote, you had to own the land and you had to be wealthy. And so now you might be saying, whoops, oh, hey, wait a minute. Those are pretty exclusive rules. What about me? I'm a renter. I'm middle income. I don't own a house. I want to change those rules. Well, if you did want to change them, you had to be able to vote for the people who made those rules. And in order to make those rules, you needed to, you needed to own land and be wealthy. Oops, sorry, I messed up the on land and be wealthy. So now I'm going to talk about land dispossession, or essentially the act of taking people away from land or taking land away from people. um, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 relocated over 46,000 Native Americans in the Southeast, which is in green on here, from their ancestral territory over to Indian territory. I put that in quotes. The Allotment Act, also known as the Dawes Act, took another 90 million acres of land from Indigenous people through its implementation. And then I reference a couple other acts that are worth looking at that enabled further dispossession, acquisition, and then sale of Indian land, where the sale money did not go to the Indigenous people. So in the United States, it's probably well known that many people of non-European backgrounds were either denied the opportunity to own property, they had their property devalued, and they were segregated into areas with flooding, pollution, toxic land, poor quality infrastructure, and substandard housing. So these practices in the 1930s through the 70s are collectively known as redlining, and they denied many African Americans, Latinx Americans, at that time also Russians, um, many people considered others. They denied them the ability to buy homes or to get loans to buy homes. And then combined with issues of local exclusionary zoning and racist real estate practices, you had artificially devaluing properties, and it segregated groups of people into these areas. And a Brookings Institute study came out in 2018 that said that owner occupied homes in majority African American US neighborhoods today are undervalued by $156 billion. Whoops, sorry, I animated that incorrectly. Also, through predatory lending and other practices, some of which were connected with the US Department of Agriculture, but also lots of violence from non-African American farmers contributed to land loss of I want to say it's roughly 90% of the acres that Black farmers used to own, and this equates to roughly another $326 billion worth of land in the study. So keep these slides in mind. And then we also see a number of states passed what are known as, quote, alien land laws, where they prevented people of Asian descent and Asian immigrants from purchasing land. And then during Executive Order 9066 that FDR passed, a number of pretty much anyone of Japanese descent, even if they were born in the United States, was forced into, quote, relocation centers or relocation camps. This is one near us, although I've recently learned that there's one about 25 minutes away from where I live now. And when they were forced to move there, their land was taken from them and their businesses were taken from them, not unlike in the Holocaust, Kristallnacht, when people of Jewish origin and background had similar things occur to them in the sense of the land dispossession as they were moved. So then finally, but this is a little bit more connected to Army Corps, although this occurs sometimes in other agencies. There was a key piece of legislation known as the Flood Control Act of 1936, which gave the Army Corps the authority to work on flood risk management projects. But there was a key component of this that required that the benefit, in order for us to do this, the benefits have to outweigh the costs. And so FEMA has a benefit cost analysis. Lots of projects and grant programs out there also have a benefit cost analysis that requires benefits be greater than the costs. And excuse me, in my limited time at the Army Corps, even though policy is slowly starting to change, institutionally, this factor has been the most significant factor in where we build projects, what kind, or whether we even build a project at all. And it can have an effect, especially when it's applied as kind of one of the only tools of prioritizing projects for communities that already have resources over those that don't. So, for example, if you live in a low cost neighborhood, which I attempted to draw on the left, um, it's likely that the cost of, quote, protecting your community or maybe elevating all that as well, mitigation is likely to be greater than the assessed value of those homes. Which makes it nearly impossible to meet the benefit to cost threshold. But on the other hand, if you're in a wealthier neighborhood, it's much more likely that the value of those houses is greater than the cost of the flood protection, making it more likely you're going to meet the threshold. So this ties back to what we just discussed about land ownership and the old rules. So you have the new rules, which tell us that benefits have to be greater than the costs. But we go, okay, well, how do we calculate benefits? Often we look at direct flood damages that would be avoided in disruption, and those damages are tied to the value of land today and historically. And so if you think about anybody who lost their land or had their land undervalued or was taken from their land, they kind of lost that bargaining chip of the value that they would need today to generate a positive benefit cost analysis. And then that's compared against the cost of building projects, which, as we know, continue to increase today. So I asked to pause for a moment, although I'm not really going to pause because we're short of time, and ask, is this just treatment and meaningful involvement? What was happening in the United States around 1936 when a lot of these laws, like the Flood Control Act, went into action? And I'll answer that for you. We were in very segregated United States, Jim Crow America. Children were not going to school together. We were using separate water fountains and many, many other issues, laws, and ways of society. So we're not in a place where the decision makers were thinking about issues of equity. And similarly, we were in a place where we undervalued natural resources. For the privileged, natural resources seemed endless and almost seemed kind of like a nuisance, right? And so you could see where a type of decision that prioritizes benefits over costs, that undervalues the natural resources, wetlands, waterways, etc., can also make it really difficult to implement nature-based solutions, right? And we're being forced to create these like ecosystem services. Let's add some values to these because we took the value away back in 1936. So what I take from a lot of this is that what's bad for people is also bad for the environment, and vice versa. So the same systems that are harmful to people are also causing environmental damage. So the last, well, okay, this isn't the last, but a couple just that I'll touch on to give you a flavor. There are dozens of ways that government programs create barriers for already overburdened communities. I'm just listing a couple here, but many of our agencies require a local cost share, and the idea there was that, oh, well, you want the locals to take some responsibility, but if you are a under-resourced community, or if you don't have, you're unincorporated, or you're a small sub-community and you don't have any sort of like political clout or decision-making authority, you're not even going to be able to come to the table to study this problem, let alone build it if it's a multi-million-dollar or billion-dollar solution. So it's like you don't have enough money in order to get the help that you need to solve your problem. Also, the Army Corps historically hasn't addressed stormwater. My understanding is that FEMA doesn't really map stormwater, and yet many of the types of flood issues that these overburdened communities that we're talking about are stormwater, urban flooding, nuisance flooding. So there's a major gap in who's able to address these issues. We also have, we know that recovery assistance can be tied to damage thresholds, or even a disaster declaration can be tied to a damage threshold. And The damages are tied and connected to land value, and we learned earlier that land value is tied and connected to historical housing and land and dispossession practices. And then also, many of you probably know that you need to be able to prove that you own your home, and that requirement disproportionately affects African American communities in the Gulf Coast, where a number have heirs property, where we pass down the homes without the official title and deed. So this is also a barrier for the Army Corps being able to elevate or implement non-structural. It's a huge issue. And then finally, I won't go into many more, but there are dozens of burdens that people are asked to deal with immediately after a disaster, or even if you're looking to the future. And there are many, many ways that many government agencies can say, no, this isn't my problem, or this isn't my authority, or I can't do this, I don't, blah, blah, blah. And many of these communities have been told no for decades. So it just kind of compounds. And then finally, key issues that the experiences of people most affected by these issues aren't well represented in the profession or in the decision making. And so um, this does not mean that if you are a person of European descent working in government or in these spaces that there is anything bad about that. But it does mean that, because everyone has their own lived experience that they bring to the table, if the people most affected by these issues are not at the table, then at best, our solutions are going to miss the mark. But at worst, we're going to cause additional harm and come up with with solutions that affect people, and we don't think about it because it doesn't affect us. So this is a very important piece, and I realize a lot of this is heavy, and so I want to say that we do the best we can until we know better, and then when we know better, we do better. So I encourage you to spend some time thinking about it, and it's okay to again feel down or uncomfortable, but then come back to it with some open eyes about how and where we can make changes. So I'm going to sum it all up, bring it together in a way that I think makes it a little maybe simpler. So the three key issues driving inequitable flood resilience from a very high level are that we had these old rules that created a physical landscape of advantage and disadvantage. And then we have current policy and practice is built kind of atop this unequal landscape. And we have the lived experience of the people most effective are not well represented in the profession or in the decision-making planning process, right? And so what we see is when there are floods and then recovery programs implemented or mitigation, we just have this increasing inequity and vulnerability. And to specify here, this advantage and disadvantage was racially explicit in the law at the time. So it was based on how people looked was what those policies were at the time. And then because we didn't ameliorate them or quote level the playing field first, and then we built these sort of neutral economics driven policies, we end up amplifying and reinforcing the inequity, getting resources to communities that have resources and not to those that need them. This leads to an inequitable distribution of the benefits and risks. So put more simply, we see unjust treatment, which we heard in the environmental justice definition. We see a challenge of access to resources and benefits. And we see issues of participation and engagement. And I want to just hit on this. Participation and engagement is so important. And if you're like me, you've definitely been in a situation where you are frustrated by the public outreach, or it's challenging, or it's not your thing, or somebody's yelled at you and you don't want to get yelled at anymore, or maybe you're a more technical person and you don't see the necessity or importance of the participation. You just kind of like want to do your thing and get your numbers. People are all across the board here. And in my experience as a consultant and in the federal government is like when you're running up against a deadline or budget, you hear one of the first line items that gets cut is the outreach. But I want to just sort of hit this one home on why outreach is so important and why participation in the decisions that affect you is essential, is because most of the people today affected by issues of environmental justice are the same people who were denied the opportunity to vote in the United States to make those decisions that affect the environment up until roughly 1965. And some could argue even still today. So, what happened in 1965? The Voting Rights Act was passed. But prior to that, as I mentioned earlier, the old rules only let you vote if you were wealthy, owned land, and of European descent. And then eventually, you quote just needed to be uh, uh, a landowner and uh, of European descent. If you didn't have to be wealthy, eventually you just needed to be of European descent. Eventually, you needed to, you could also be, sorry, I mentioned a male, you needed to also be a male. In the early 1920s, women of European descent could vote, but not all women. In the 1990s, the Americans with Disabilities Act finally required that voting polls and stations be accessible for people with disabilities or older adults or different languages, right? But anyway, so thinking about prior to 1965, all of these decisions that shaped our environment in the United States, including where people live, where the petrochemical plants go, who is served by infrastructure and water, and who is served by access to recreation, and what kinds of zoning was in place. So many of those decisions that shape our situation today were made before the people most affected had a say in them. So, um, how we change so that everyone thrives. And I'm going to do this in my last 4 minutes. And you could have a whole second on the how we change piece, but I'm going to leave us with kind of like a framework and some high level things. So I say we take the framework that we just went through and use it. Start simple, start small, and interrupt the cycle, right? Acknowledge the unjust treatment that happened. Not only will that go a huge way in building relationships with communities that are tired of being told that it's their fault that they're in their situation, but it also allows us to document more fully the stories of people who are somewhere and what happened there and why that matters. It also acknowledges the cultures and the life ways of people who have had historically connections to the land. We also can do everything that we can to push for access to resources and benefits. Even if we don't have the authority, we can connect someone to an agency that does have an authority, or a nonprofit organization that can compensate a community for their time, that sort of thing. And then all we can do to share and power in decision making. In some cases, this means that when our congressionals come to meet with us about our projects, I directly introduce them to the communities with environmental justice concerns, so they now have a direct line to that congressperson, right? That's one way we can share and power in decision making. In any case, whatever the action or policy or program you're working on, you can also address this by asking 3 questions. Who's going to benefit from this thing that I'm about to do? Who is burdened by it, and how might they be burdened or left behind? And who gets to decide? And then kind of the idea is who also is not at the table. In our individual practice, this can look like prioritizing your limited time and resources for the actions that are going to advance equity, right? So if you have 100 emails, respond to the ones first that come from people with environmental justice concerns, or that come from the people who are working to advance projects in these communities. You can also amplify voices and perspectives of people most affected by these issues. Seek out and feature diverse perspectives and life experiences on your panels, on your webinars. Facilitate meetings differently. Notice who can speak up and who is not speaking up, and create a space for them to do so. Notice who is taking up a lot of space and ask them to step back a little bit. Speak up when actions don't align with your values, and find your people. Be aware of perceived neutrality, because as you've seen, like, being neutral kind of allows the things just to continue to perpetuate. And then finally, remember that this work isn't about us, even when it feels like it is. So if you're in a challenging situation, or you notice yourself being defensive, just pause and go, this is not about me. We're here to get to yes to make things better for people. I would also recommend these 3 books, in particular, these 2 books like really opened my eyes for the government agency connection to environmental justice. And how it's baked in. And I think the more that we see that, read these and understand, you can start to like see opportunities in your own agency. Even just, I'm sure Pamela can tell you much more, but in Georgia, you know, there are these great resources that you can do to learn about like who is there, who was there, what the context was. There's an amazing website called Segregation by Design. It mostly has urban areas right now, but for those of you working in urban areas, it can be really helpful about everything that happened in that area. It's very visual. And then finally, practice saying yes and or both and what I mean by that is when you find yourself in any situation thinking like either or like, oh, I'm working on this project and I really need to do it for this partner, but oh, look, the community has challenges. Like, you don't have to dismiss their challenges just because the project is hard, or convince yourself that something isn't important or that you can't do anything about it. When you find yourself saying yes and both and, we can like really get ourselves and our minds open to what is possible and help everybody get to things that that work. And it also avoids gaslighting people, which nobody likes. So with that, I'll say thank you. And please, ask any questions, reach out to us. And I guess we have like 5 minutes left. So
Yes.
I think we hit it right on. And then I think I'm supposed to go to this slide. And I also have resources that are in the slide deck that we can send you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jessica and Pamela, both. We did have one comment in the chat. Some homeowners are better resourced to wait for the government aid to come through. We had one family wait over 2 years after they moved out of their flooded home for our FEMA buyout grant to come through.
Wow.
And yeah, I can.
Wow.
And
Thank you for sharing
you
that.
mentioned some of the resources that will be in the slide deck when people get them. What other technical assistance, either through Silver Jackets or the Corps, are available for the communities looking to address some of the equity in their communities?
Yeah. Pamela, do you wanna answer that one since you're the tech
Sure.
assistance person in Georgia? Okay.
Yeah. So our technical assistance programs typically are our floodplain management services program, which looks at reducing flooding and other kinds of floodplain mitigation for that purpose. And then our planning assistance to states program. The first program that I mentioned, it also has a sub program, which is a interagency collaboration for non-structural and nature-based uh, solutions. So those are essentially an opportunity to just build the information. Nothing would be constructed on the ground to promote that equity, but it would be the information and the tools and the resources that you need to put you in that better position. And the floodplain management services program is 100% federally funded. It typically starts with a letter saying that we have a flooding issue and we have floodplain erosion and when we need help. And then it's really easy. It's not easy. Nothing in life is easy, but it's a more simple program to get through. And then our planning assistance to states program studies all things water, not just flood risk, but all things, and can do the same kind of technical examinations and comprehensive planning. And it's a cost share program, so that there's still some investment from the community on that one.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to both of you. I hope everyone feels like they're better informed on the justice initiatives and equity that we can all embrace. And we're going to keep the chat open for a few more minutes to make sure
Yeah.
that everybody gets in their name and email so that they can get their continuing education credits. If you'll go ahead and do that in the chat now. We also have the survey available. We hope you will fill out that survey so that we can improve these webinars. We do appreciate you doing that. Again, a copy of the presentation will be emailed to all attendees. If you're requesting continuing education credits, those certificates will be emailed separately. We do have our next Lunch and Learn scheduled for May 1st from 12 to 1. We're going to go back to our 12 to 1 time frame. It is the history of flooding in Georgia and what to do after the disaster. We do have a link for registration available, but we'll also be sending that out via email. So if you don't get a hold of that link for the registration, don't worry, we will be sending out that email for the invite. And if everyone doesn't have any more questions, this ends our Lunch and Learn. Thank you so much for everyone's time.
Yeah, and we're also happy if anybody does want to stay on the line. I think I have a bit more time to answer questions, and also I put my email in the chat. Maybe Pamela wants to put hers in too. We can talk with you more about technical assistance as well if you're interested in that. Yeah. Can we get a copy of the presentation? Yes, I believe they will be sending it out. And thanks everyone for joining.
I have to admit that was a lot of information. Sometimes it takes a lot of time to absorb it, and then you think, oh, wait a minute, I wish I had asked.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I usually don't get a lot of questions after this one, I think because of that. But yeah. But always happy to
what are the flood
provide a part two. Oh.
Donovan asked, what is USACE? What are the floodplain support provided? What are the floodplains?
Is that
Sorry, go ahead, Jessica.
Oh, good. So I think related to the that Pamela was sharing, like the floodplain management one, we have the ability through that one, and it's free, no cost share, as she mentioned, to conduct flood modeling, flood mapping, emergency action planning, where we get like a number of parties in the room to try to document emergency protocols. We kind of any and all things floodplain that give a partner or community information that they can use to kind of move to their next step. I believe in some districts we do mapping for FEMA, like flood insurance rate maps. I know we're doing some of that for tribal partners right now too. But these programs are covered under the Justice 40 initiative, so we're being asked to prioritize them, particularly for communities that have environmental justice concerns. So that's an awesome one to use because there's no cost share. I hope that helps. And I guess here, actually, maybe I can write, if you Google search this services program, if you Google search this phrase that I just put in there, you should be able to get a list of just like various, all the districts have web pages that usually include that. And there's probably the same blurb and list of bullet points of like, these are the types of studies we can do under here. They're also much faster. They're and they don't require as much bureaucracy. Our headquarters doesn't like when I say this, but it's basically free consulting. So if you can tolerate the Army Corps, it's a pretty good gig.
I certainly appreciate it because I know that's that. And thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Monique.
Because I seem to recall having listened to the presentation when one of the first meetings that you had that you were trying with ASFPM, and yeah, the different groups that were trying to put in. Well, this is how I'm coming at it, and this is how, and I was like, wow. Just wow, that's a lot. So
yeah.
All right. Well, I think we've about got it down to the last you, me, and Isabel. So I'm gonna say we need to put a fork in it because I know
Okay, I'm gonna go
everybody's
ahead
got.
and stop recording then.